Excellent.
Okay, so we're here today to talk about a brand new book written by Professor Jenny Carson, A Matter of Moral Justice, Black Women Laundry Workers and the Fight for Justice. Great new book. It looks backwards, I know, on the screen, but this is it. And I poured through every page. And I'm excited to be here with you, Professor Carson. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We have a series of 4 or 5 questions that I'll just read just for brevity, and free to respond for as thoroughly as long as you like. So the first question for our audience is, Professor Carson, your description of the history of laundries, of laundry work is absolutely fascinating. And I just, for our audience, most of us, when we think about laundry, like the laundry we do every day, we think about self-service laundromats, our own washing machines, in our houses or apartments or down in the, however we share laundry like that, or drop off laundries, maybe dry cleaning. But that's not the way, that's not who you're describing. That what you describe are industrial laundries. And I at least have not had much experience with an industrial laundry. So I hope that you could describe those for us at the turn of the last century, how they operated, who took their clothes there, all of those things.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks so much. And this is a great question to start with. And what really drew me to the laundry industry in the first place was that in some ways, I think it's really a forgotten industry, right? Because as you say, today, laundry work is mostly done in private homes, right? And but 100 years ago, many families and almost all commercial establishments actually sent their laundry out to one of these industrial or factory laundries. And as a result, by 1930, the laundry industry is actually one of the largest service industries in the US. It kind of has its heyday in the 30s and the 40s, and it declines in the 50s, but as I discuss in the epilogue, it hasn't gone away, right? We still have industrial laundries. We have companies like Cintas and Aramark that do a lot of business, mostly for corporations, for hospitals, for big entities. Now, the origins go way back to the 1850s when collar manufacturers in Troy, New York, constructed some of the first kind of quasi-mechanized centralized laundries. And these are covered, I think, really beautifully by Carol Turbin in her Collar Cities. In her book Color City, but the industry doesn't really take off on a mass scale until about 1900. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. It's urbanization. People move to cities and they don't have the space, right? That the rural housewife did, or domestic servant to collect water and wash outside with scrub boards and hang the laundry. So urbanization, the concentration of sort of local markets, creates a demand for new methods of laundering, and so does the rise of hotels and restaurants and steamships, and these are companies that provide that use a lot of flat work. And so here I'm talking about linens like towels and sheets and all of which then was washed and also quite often pressed. And then people have bigger wardrobes, right? Because of the ready-to-wear clothing industry, and expectations of cleanliness are rising, right? It's becoming sort of socially taboo to wear dirty clothes. So for all these reasons, we have the demand for new, more efficient methods of laundering at the same time that we have technological development. So we have these huge cylindrical washing machines that are constructed and big tumblers and presses. We have flat work ironers, which are massive machines, kind of like rolling pins, where workers will feed sheets into them on one side and collect them on the other side. And you asked if this is a factory, and yes, in many ways, it's absolutely a factory. There's dozens of departments, right? The laundry goes in through the sorting room. It's sorted by workers, by fabric, by sort of the method of washing. It goes to the washing department, where it's all men who load up the garments and, you know, put in the chemicals and adjust the water. Then it goes to the tumblers, the drying department. Then it goes to the shakers. It goes to the ironing department, which is the biggest department in the plant. It goes to the starchers. So yeah, like these are big industrial settings with many departments, a detailed division of labor. Workers now are working under the supervision of a foreman, of a supervisor. So we see that very sort of, you know, the de-skilling of work, the managerial control being implemented that we see in other industries, like the garment industry, of course. And it has all this sort of elements of sweatshop labor, of very poor industrial work, right? They're dangerous places to work. Workers fall on the slippery floors, right? They burn themselves on the presses, the chemicals, they breathe in the chemicals. So like rheumatism, arthritis. We have a lot of the women, you know, it's mostly women, as we'll discuss in the next question, you know, the women suffer a lot of health ailments. And I want to point out that the laundry is it is one of the most difficult industries. You know, you're dealing with, on one end, dirty clothes, right? And there's just horror stories of what comes in, right? You know, cockroaches and and such. And it's really heavy work. Like you're lifting heavy wet clothing, and the presses are creating all this steam. So it's really difficult work. It's low status, and it pays among the lowest wages. So this is really, you know, difficult work. Now, I want to say just really quickly is that industrial laundries don't, you know, entirely displace the home laundress, or like, you know, so we have these sort of two methods existing alongside one another for a very long time, and especially in the South. And what I found that I think is really interesting is, first of all, it's an urban industry, right? Like in rural areas, people will wash clothes by hand for much longer. And in some ways, it almost jumps from like hand washing to like getting home washing machines. Like it's not a huge industry in rural areas. And it's not a big industry in the South. So in 1930, there's 400 power laundries in New York City and 56 in Alabama. And so the question is like, why doesn't it take off in the South? And one of the reasons I argue is because in the South, we have, she was known as a Black washerwoman, you know, Black women who would take in clothes for low wages, right? Because of lack of employment opportunities. And that sort of impeded the development of power laundries because they couldn't compete. And so, yeah, so it's, you know, it's an urban northern industry.
It's just so fascinating, Jenny, to think about. And it seems as if this will be a part of the next question, so you don't have to answer this, but just thinking about the differences between New York City and you know, cities even in the South is fascinating. It seems like the pull of white Southerners to want Black women to do their laundry is what stops the power laundries from growing to the same extent. And I know you talk about that in the book fully. So, okay, thank you so much for the description. The next question is kind of related. So, your book is a major contribution to our understanding of how work gets typed. And by typed, I mean typed by race, typed by gender, and it's a word that we historians, of course, use in order to figure out why some jobs are always performed, as you just described, in the South, perhaps laundry by Black women. How does that happen? And so I wanted to see, I was really hoping you would describe for us the variety of jobs. You started that a little bit already, that people did in these industrial laundries. Maybe not exactly how much they were paid, but hierarchically, which jobs were paid the most, which the least. And if you can get to this, what explains that differential? Who's doing the highest paid work in the laundry? Who's doing the lowest paid? Maybe something in between. And the best, you know, of all, your book is fascinating, but it actually answers some of that. So, and those are not easy questions to ask or answer. So I thought maybe you could.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think, one of the biggest stories here is who does the work in power laundries, right? And why that happens. And so what I argue in the book is that it's gendered labor, right? But it's also racialized labor. And something I learned, early on in the project is that by 1930, the power laundry is the leading industrial employer of Black women in the United States. So more Black women work in the power laundry industry than any other industry, including tobacco, including the garment industry. And, when I started this, that really surprised me because I hadn't heard a lot about them. And so I thought this is an important story to tell. I was originally going to write about the Women's Trade Union League, where I found the laundry workers and realized, no, the real story is the laundry workers, right? And not that the Women's Trade Union League isn't important, but so it's female labor for all the reasons, feminist labor historians have taught us. It's the expansion of a traditionally home-based job, right, that involves performing, ostensibly unskilled labor related to the care and maintenance of the family. So, that's not a surprise. But he argued that it's also racialized labor in the United States, both when it's done in private homes for wages and also in industrial settings. And once again, I think we can trace this racialization back to the era of slavery, when Black women washed clothes for wages, and then into the Jim Crow South, when even the very, very poorest white families would not do their own laundry. They would hire an African-American laundress or washerwoman who was ubiquitous in the South, right? And I argue that she relieves the white families of this burdensome household chore. Housewives always describe laundry as their very least favorite task, but that she also serves as this kind of critical link to a racial past in which Black people were literally owned by white families. So she serves as this link, right, to a racial past of slavery. And this is why, white workers don't go near this work. White women won't do laundry work in the South. And so I argue, as the work industrializes, as a power laundry industry emerges in the North, this is one of the reasons why, Black women do get hired in power laundries, because of this sort of racial past. And it's also because, laundry owners actively recruit Black women. It's a service industry, right? As services, it doesn't manufacture a good, and business costs 50% of business costs come in the form of labor costs. So they're looking for, traditionally low wage workers who are structurally disadvantaged. And what I found was that in New York City in the 1920s, many laundry owners will close shop from other locations in the city and move to Harlem. They'll move to Brownsville, Brooklyn, where there's large Black populations, and recruit Black workers. And then, of course, pay them less than white workers. But this is also, I think, something interesting I discovered, that Black women will actively seek out these jobs in cities like New York, in cities like Chicago and Washington. And that sort of goes against how we have thought about it in the past. Scholars have kind of talked about industrial laundry work as, evidence of the dubious nature of Black women's, occupational advancement in the urban industrial North, right? Seeing it as part of this continuum of low status degrading service work. But reading the oral histories, reading the Women's Bureau reports and other primary documents, I found that, Black women are actively seeking out these jobs in power laundries. Why? Because they're better than domestic service, right? Which is the primary occupation for Black women in this period in the urban North. And, so they don't just fall into this work, there's agency here. They're looking for jobs here as sort of the first step on the industrial ladder, right? As part of their proletarianization, a term, Joe Trotter has described, right? And why is it better? Well, more autonomy, right? You're not in a private household, better wages, and they get to develop these networks, right? At work, and then later, in some places in the union hall. And actually my first chapter in the book is called We Win a Place in Industry. And it comes from a 1929 article in the National Urban League Opportunity, which is celebrating these jobs for Black women. Like, we're finally getting our foot into the industrial ladder. So this isn't to say, you know, it's not terrible work, it's not difficult work, but that we see here Black women exercising agency within a labor market narrowly circumscribed by race and gender discrimination. I don't know if we have time to talk about it, but you know, at least I'll highlight one interesting thing is that a big division in the industry is between the drivers, these are the outside workers, and the inside workers. The drivers are all white men. Laundry employers, laundry owners are all white men too, right? Their access to capital, but they only hire white men to drive the trucks and deliver the laundry. And so you know, the reason I argue is that they're the representatives of the business, right? So they want to present this sort of white male face of this kind of professional now scientific industry, sort of, you know, hiding the fact that the work is done by poorly paid, you know, women, people of color. But also because I argue, you know, there would have been an objection to Black men, because, you know, Black men were more considered for driving jobs than women, but there would have been opposition to Black men coming into, you know, private spaces like door stoops and apartment hallways where white women were passing off the laundry, right? So these sort of racist stereotypes of, you know, Black men preying on white women would have made that sort of, well, I'll just say the employers were happy to police the sexual boundaries, right? That were in place because of these racist stereotypes. And then just really quickly within the plants, I also found this really interesting. Washing jobs are always women's work, right? They're historically women's work. So once it moves into the industry and they're using machines and they're adding chemicals and detergents and adjusting water temperature, all of a sudden it's regendered as men's work. Washing jobs in power laundries are men's work. Women cannot get access to these jobs. Why? Well, they pay the most. They're considered the most complicated, right? Because before sort of, you know, mixed solutions, washing solutions, you had to like do these little calculations, and it was just deemed kind of too scientific for women. It was also deemed too heavy, which is ironic because women had been lugging loads of laundry and water from streams, you know, but all of a sudden now it's just too heavy, women are too delicate. And so the head washer is always a white man. He's kind of in control of the plant. He has the highest paying job alongside drivers. And then Black women are hired primarily to work as ironers. And these are the hardest jobs in the plant. They're the hottest. They create some of the most, you know, steamy conditions. They're considered the lowest status and they pay the least. So what we see is we sort of have a hierarchy with white men at the top, drivers, head washers. They earn 2 to 3 times as much as the Black women, who are almost all concentrated in the ironing department. And there's white women there too, and they're in the ironing department, but they also get marking and sorting jobs, which are higher status and higher pay. Black women don't get those jobs. So we have a really detailed division of labor. Your race, your genders, it determines what job you're likely to get, how much you're going to make. And these occupational divisions, I find this so interesting, are really still intact today. So today at places like Cintas, they hire men to drive. Women rarely get those jobs. They hire often white men as head washers. So this kind of, I argue that this kind of race and sex typing that takes place in an industry's formative years can really, really take root, right? And, you know, I draw on Ruth Milkman's work where she talks about how, you know, they become, the demand for these jobs becomes sex and race specific, right? And really hard to change over time. Yeah, so that's kind of, sorry, I went over what I expected
Didn't
to
go
do,
over at all. It's just,
yeah, it's very interesting how,
so
you know, it is also socially constructed, right? Our ideas about who can do what kind of work, and I think this just really shows that.
All of it is so interesting, but the regendering is so powerful.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
You take washing and you add a machine and you add some chemicals, and all of a sudden it's and then it's paid more if men do it. It's just shows how arbitrary all of that has always been. So I so appreciated reading that too in the book. So moving on to the next question, you know, this is a labor history, so we need to hear from you about the unions that these women organized. Unions were the route out for the misery of these jobs, and they were firebrands. The women that you talked about were just amazing. So I wanted to, at the first question, which were the most effective labor unions out there organizing laundries and over the time periods that you discussed? Who was leading the unions? How did they get people involved? The perennial question for labor union organizers, how do you get people in? So.
Okay, amazing question. Yeah, I'll start sort of more broadly with the organizations, then we can move into the individuals. And what really struck me is there's so many organizations involved with the laundry workers. So my story by the middle is focusing on New York City. This is the leading center of the industry. It has more laundries than any other city. It has by 1930 it has 30,000 workers. So it's a huge industry in New York. And so what I found is there are so many labor, women's, civil rights organizations involved in laundry organizing. And I think the plurality of these groups really speaks to like how horrific the conditions were, right? Like people really, it was started getting media attention because people started to worry too about like, oh my God, where are my clothes being washed, right? But also to the diversity of the workers, right? Which will attract a bunch of different kinds of allies. Now, the major union for laundry workers in this era is the AFL affiliated Laundry Workers International Union. And like many other AFL unions, it's craft union. The drivers are going to organize with the Teamsters. This is a huge problem. The inside workers ostensibly are to organize with the Laundry Workers International Union, but the AFL is very uninvolved. This is a really weak union. It's run by white men. It doesn't do much effective organizing. So the workers are going to get support from different places. And one of those places was the New York Women's Trade Union League. And this is, as you probably know, it's cross-class feminist labor organization that's really active in the progressive era. And they become really interested in the laundry workers. And part of that is because of Rose Schneiderman, who's president of the league by the 1920s. And she becomes really more and more invested in laundry workers as the workforce transitions in the 1920s from predominantly white to interracial, right? And Black women enter the industry in large numbers in the 1920s because of the Great Migration, because they're moving to New York City from the South and from abroad, right? One of my main characters is Trinidadian. She moves in 1924 to New York City. And Schneiderman is really, I argue, really interested in helping these workers, in part because large numbers are Black women. She sees this as an opportunity for the labor movement to demonstrate that, its efficacy to Black women. And so the league will, support, various efforts among the workers to organize. In 1924, Black women in New York organize a local of ironers. That will affiliate with the AFL. Now it collapses pretty quickly, and that's because the men don't support it, but who does support it is the Women's Trade Union League. Also, other groups in New York, the Trade Union Committee for Organizing Negro Workers. This is the predecessor to the Negro Labor Committee. These are socialist-led Black labor organizations headed by A. Philip Randolph and Frank Crossway. They also become interested in the laundry workers. And what I argue is that, with the support of these allies, the workers are developing this really kind of like a more robust unionism. With support from the Women's Trade Union League, the women are sort of developing kind of an industrial feminism, right? Using Annalise Orlick's term, like they want a union, not just to improve wages, right? But to tackle other issues like sexual harassment in the industry. They want a union to build community. They want a union to provide workers with like social opportunities and cultural opportunities. And they're going to, the women with the Women's Trade Union League and other supporters, like they're going to ally with a whole bunch of different groups, the suffrage movement earlier, and again, civil rights organizations later. And so just like really quickly, other groups that support the workers, communists. And, at first I was surprised, like all of a sudden I find in the early 1930s, communists who are laundry workers start organizing. We have shop floor movements emerging in the early 30s, and communists are really at the forefront of leading strikes and employing an industrial and interracial unionism, right? And, I was like, oh, I was kind of surprised by that, but why would I be surprised, right? Like as we know from your work, from Martha Biondi and others, right? Communists were, especially in the 30s, at the forefront of promoting interracial unionism, of pursuing racial justice. And so in 1931, actually, and I have a chapter on this, the communists will help the workers found an industrial laundry union, one that unites the inside workers with the drivers. This is called the Laundry Workers Industrial Union, and it will affiliate with the Communist Party Trade Union Unity League. And in the early 30s, they lead some of the biggest strikes in Harlem and the Bronx. And Black workers, they come out in huge numbers. They join the Laundry Workers Industrial Union. Not a lot of them join the party, and this is a disappointment to radical leaders, but they will, work within this left-led union. And that organizing in the early 30s, I argue, really lays the groundwork for unionization in 1937 under the CIO and the ACWA. And so what we see, we see Women's Trade Union League, Communist Party, Negro Labor Committee, all these organizations working with the workers to support their unionism. Now, your next question, I want to let you ask it because I can drill down into who were these women, right?
They were so cool. I think that
they are amazing.
In the realm of labor history, what I just love about your book is that Black women are at the center of it, and you found their voices, and now we can see, although we talk about it as much as we can all the time, yours is one of the best studies I've seen with Black women at the center from start to finish. And it's so powerful because you don't have to guess what it is white women are, doing for them. We have the WTUL in there, right? But it's their story, and you did a great job telling those. So if you could just, for our, whoever's listening, tell us about these women. They were amazing.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start with Charlotte Adelman and Dolly Robinson. I am going to talk a little bit as well about Jessie Smith and Beatrice Lumpkin, who are white Jewish radical women who support the campaign. But so Charlotte Adelman is a star of my story. And her, her co-workers, when they talk about her in reverential tones, right? She's a fierce nationalist. She was a Garveyite, a militant fighter, right? Who was just uncompromising in her commitment to Black workers, right? And her insistence that labor address not just economic issues, but issues of racial justice, right? And so she was infamous for doing things like she would spit in the face of a union boss, right? When he was being discriminatory. She was famous for the headbutt, right? Which was she would throw a boss to the ground all without ever lifting a finger. I mean, she was just pure strength. She wore man-tailored suits. Everyone talked about, little felt hats pulled over her head, a tie, a shirt, comfortable walking shoes. And she was just, militant to the core, right? Maida Springer funnily said, oh, these people who think they're nationalists today, they never met Charlotte Adelman. She was the one, right? And she moves from Port of Spain, Trinidad, to New York City in 1924. She comes alone. She's 19. She joins her sister in Harlem, where she lives with her family, and she gets her first job in Empower Laundry, right? And this is a common trajectory for Black women, right, who move to the city, right? And as they say, prefer this over domestic service. And she eventually moves to Brownsville, Brooklyn, out on her own, and continues to work in laundries. And in 1933, she approaches a group of drivers in Brooklyn who are organized with the Teamsters, local 810. And she says, I want to organize the inside workers. So can you support me? They blow her off, right? They're like, do it yourself. So she begins in 1933 holding meetings in her Thetford Avenue home, right? And the 8 workers come to that first meeting. And this is sort of like, the union later pays homage to this as kind of the nucleus that gets the ball rolling. We have the radical organizing in the early 30s, organizing in Brooklyn. And in 1937, there's a famous night in June. It's this, hot summer night, and Adelman's there. And we assume Adelman's there because the union records really focus on the men who are there, which is sort of the latter part of the story, unfortunately. But the workers on that night unanimously vote to leave the AFL and to affiliate with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They get a local industrial union charter, and within a couple months, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers takes in the laundry workers as an affiliate. And then a whole bunch of organizing proceeds after this, and all of New York's laundry workers are organized, 30,000 workers. So it's a huge union victory. And the CIO kind of like, in the ACWA kind of take credit for it, right? Like, oh, we brought in this poor, demoralized workforce, part of our commitment to racial justice, and it was the right thing to do. But what I show is like, they were already organized, right? They've been organizing since the early 30s. They had a union. It just, they kind of like, the CIO comes at a moment when organizing has reached its peak, right? And so, I argue that it's Adelman's organizing. It's her very good friend Robinson's organizing that leads to organization. So Robinson is her very, very close friend. Robinson is also a Black woman. I think people know Dolly Robinson a bit better because she goes on to high-level posts in the Women's Bureau, in the Department of Labor, in the Kennedy administration. And she's written about by Dorothy Sue Cobble and others. So I think we know a bit more about her. But she begins her career of activism in laundries. She moves to New York City from North Carolina with her mom in 1930. She's 14, 15 at this point, and she begins working part-time in a Brooklyn laundry while she's going to high school and organizing a Negro Problems Club. Like, she's already active in civil rights. And she is there at a really pivotal strike in Brooklyn in 1934, and one that I believe Eleanor Roosevelt had lent her Secret Service agents to. So Eleanor Roosevelt is a member of the Women's Trade Union League. It's really supportive, right? And this is where those kind of elite alliances could really generate some traction, right? And so Robinson is at this pivotal strike, and she's so mad because the women always send her away before the police come to arrest workers. They're very protective of her. But she says, that those who were arrested were aristocrats of the movement. So like from the beginning, she wants to be in on the action. She is in on the action. They send her away, but she comes back, and she is part of the original group that joins the CIO in 1937 and continues to organize, right? She becomes a union leader, and in the 40s, she is the head of the education department of the union. It's called the Laundry Workers Joint Board. So she develops a really robust educational program. She provides, piano lessons and violin lessons for poor Black laundry workers and their families, since she sees this as really sort of central to unions, like empowering people and providing them with opportunities. And so she's head of the education department. Charlotte Adelman is a business agent. She's the only Black female business agent in the union from 1938 to 1950. And both women, I argue, like they're leaders of this union. They're kind of like, they have huge followings of the workers. They're very close friends. They work together, and they, a lot of the descriptions of them are that they have like complementary leadership styles. Like Adelman is really fierce. She's like, she would be considered confrontational, but only because she's demanding things that are reasonable, and that's being rejected by the white male leadership, right? Like, and Robinson Robinson was sort of had a different approach. Like she built like alliances with progressives. She used worker education. She was kind of a little bit more diplomatic, you might want to say, and she definitely understood her role as like trying to create a protective space, like try to have alliances that would protect Adelman when she got in trouble, right? And because Adelman is of course suspended in 1940 for calling Hyman Bloomberg, the head of the union, a racist. And then she's eventually ejected in 1949 for insubordination, right? And so the women like, but for, you know, for over a decade, they work really well together with Adelman sort of at the forefront of these battles, and Robinson beside her, but working to sort of like, you know, keep her there so that she can continue the fight. And then I want to tell you about two other women if there's time. Yeah. So the two other women are Jessie Smith and Beatrice Shapiro Lumpkin, and they are in the mid and late 1930s. They're teenagers. They're young Jewish white radicals who are laundry workers and communists who also are just really committed to racial justice, right? Like they've been exposed to these ideas in their homes, in their communities, in the party, and they are really also very like militant in their insistence that the issues of racial justice be addressed by the union, right? That it's not just enough to win higher wages, but that they want to see Black people get access to all jobs in the industry. They want to see the sexual harassment of Black women stopped. And I was super lucky that I got to interview both women. And so some of the stories come from the interviews with them. Unfortunately, by the time I started this project, Robinson and Adelman had passed. I wasn't able to interview them personally, but I was able to interview Jessie and B. And B, I have to mention that Beatrice Lumpkin is alive and well today. She's 103. She is in Chicago. She continues to organize. She now goes out in a hazmat suit, right, to protect her from COVID-19 that her grandson constructed. She's still, fighting for a Chicago teacher. She became a mathematics professor. Eventually, she's still a communist. She just founded a organization to connect sort of retirees and young people emerging the labor movement. And so, their stories, I think, were really useful in that they sort of augmented what Dolly Robinson and Charlotte Adelman were saying, which was that it was great to unionize, like in 1937, but then it led to like a very different experience. And what we see in the 40s is, in particular, the amalgamated clothing workers, they have the laundry workers as an affiliate, and they really just take over. And they put white male garment union leaders in charge of the union. They kind of handpick some white male laundry officials. They run the union together. When Black women and their radical allies demand, equal pay for equal work, when they demand that the union challenge discriminatory hiring practices, racist hiring practices, they push back. This is a leadership that wants to maintain the status quo. It privileges white men. They're fine with that. In fact, they'll actively work to protect that privilege. And they will become very disgruntled when Adelman and Robinson, representing, the Black workers in the industry, push back, and as well when the radicals push back. So Jessie and B are ejected in 1941. All the communists are out, ostensibly for being, for pushing communism, but of course, I argue for challenging the business unionism, the bureaucratic unionism that's taking root in the laundry union under the ACWA. And then, of course, Adelman and Robinson are pushed out in 49 and 50. And so, it's in a way, it's sad. Like the story ends on this kind of not triumphal note. And I thought about, I should end in 1940. It's so great. They win higher wages, a closed shop. But, I started looking ahead, right, in the records. I'm like, this is going somewhere not good. So I want to tell that story too. But these four women, around whom I organized a book are really like what they bring and what attracts people is this, I argue, this kind of social justice, civil rights-based unionism, right? That sees a union as something that can do more than just win wages, right? But pursue racial justice, gender equality, that will create community, that will provide social and cultural opportunities. They have this really expansive vision of the union and of the labor movement. And really, like, to be fair, they're just asking the CIO to live up to its principles, right? To what it's saying it's going to do and how it's going to be different than from the AFL. So they're just really calling them on, their promises.
Oh, Jenny, I mean, I know, having written similarly about how the story looks great and then falls off in the same time period. It's still hopeful, however, in your work, to see how powerful that vision was for those 4 women and all the other women who were in the unions affiliated organizations that were working with them. That was really hopeful. Yeah, because they couldn't control how the structural issues that they were facing. They couldn't control the white leadership of the ACWA, but man, did they live and breathe that vision. And think about episodes in US history where that vision holds so many people in is actually really hopeful, even when the ending is not so great.
This is so true. And they all continue to organize, right? Yes. With the exception of Adelman, who is the one person who everyone talks about, just was utterly devastated by her ousting, right? So there's that, but then you're right. Sort of the inspiration they provided and the fact that, with the exception of Adelman, they go on and organize, right? And they've learned valuable lessons and from their laundry. Yeah, experience.
And now with your history of them, we can be re-inspired by a broad vision, by unions, those unions that take on that broad vision, I think seem to be able to pull people in differently than a bread and butter kind of approach, right?
So for sure.
For sure. Okay, so I think we'll just push forward. And the last question that I wanted to ask you is, can you sort of bring us to the present with Cintas and where are these, tell us what's happening in big power laundries today, what's going on with labor organizing and is it similar?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I said, power laundries don't disappear, right? They're now, run though centrally by companies like Cintas and Aramark. And Cintas is the largest industrial launderer and uniform rental provider in the US. And I'm in Canada. We have them up here in Canada. I see their trucks on the road all the time, the black, red, and white trucks. As I discussed in the book, Cintas is a particularly terrible employer, which is a problem because as the biggest one, they set the standard in the industry, right? And so what we see is we think of power laundries today, like they're shinier, they're more mechanized, like we have robotic everything, like robotic washers and conveyor systems. So we think, a union organizer I talked to said, we think of them, Katie Unger said, we think of them as sort of cleaner and safer. And they're not at all, right? Like if anything, they're just as dangerous. There's been horrific accidents at Cintas where workers have been pulled into industrial dryers and locked in there and burned to death. This has happened twice, both completely avoidable accidents. They've gotten huge fines by OSHA, right, for negligence in protecting workers from the machinery. So, they remain hot, sweaty, difficult, and dangerous, and sometimes deadly places to work. Laundry workers also continue to earn among the lowest wages of industrial workers. And then that racial division and gender division of labor that I talked about is still in place today. So all of these conditions have spurred efforts to unionize, right? And in 2000, a kind of core group of Cintas workers supported by Unite Here, it was Unite, it hadn't merged yet, but it becomes Unite Here, launched a campaign to organize Cintas workers through card check and neutrality agreements. And so I followed this campaign for quite a while, and I wrote an article on it, and it's the epilogue of the book. And interviewed a bunch of the women. And what is interesting, women of color, once again, were leading this campaign, right? They had a lot of trouble getting the men to support for a bunch of reasons, but so women of color, core group of them leading this campaign and doing like the kind of amazing like grassroots rank and file organizing that I saw being effective in the 30s, right? Like, you know, home visits and going door to door, like that kind of holding, you know, trying to develop shop organizing committees, but that they were having so much trouble mobilizing the workers. And the reason I argue was primarily just massive fear of retaliation. Cintas is a really, like Walmart, like all of them, like really anti-union, but they're like really at the top. Like they hire industrial psychologists to come in and talk to the workers, captive audience meetings, illegal surveillance of union organizers. And so really it's a workforce that's really scared. A lot of them are immigrants and they play around with fears of deportation. And so they just, you know, the campaign kind of, like it just didn't result in unionization. And despite like really heroic efforts of these women of color who were taking extraordinary risks, right, to try to organize, a lot of them are Latina now, but there is still Latina, Black. It's still a racialized occupation. But just to say quickly, like I also sort of make the case that, like, you know, had unions kind of like what they're doing is trying to, you know, what I saw, I think it was just a great campaign called Uniform Justice. What I did see them doing was like a lot of that kind of expansive organizing I saw in the 30s. So like working with the NAACP, Interfaith Worker Justice, Jobs with Justice, like trying to build those community coalitions and organizing around multiple identities, right? And putting, you know, racial justice and gender equality at the center of the campaign. So I think it was a great campaign, and a core, you know, group of worker leaders really rose to the occasion. But like it's such an anti-union company. The legal and political climate's so different, right? Like Beatrice, I remember interviewing her, and she's like, you know, the first thing we would do in 1937 is read the Wagner Act to all the workers and remind them that President Roosevelt said you should join a union. So, you know, well, what are they going to say? President Trump wants you to join a union, like, you know, and the National Labor Relations Board is on your side. Like, you know, I mean, it's not. And so for a bunch of reasons, like that campaign kind of hasn't had the success we saw in 1937, despite being creative and using that kind of some really interestingly similar strategies, right?
It's amazing how important the government's support or lack thereof is. Yeah. Especially both in the Wagner Act and whatever, you know, slant the NLRB is taking at the, you know, under whatever presidential administration is in place. Right? So it is everything. I mean, I don't know. It's not everything, but it's a lot. It's a big part of it.
Yeah, it's a big part of it. It's a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
You know,
I can't even imagine how powerful it would have been to, as B said, to go and say the president says you should organize a union,
right? Yeah,
and how that would give them some backing, right? So that they couldn't have been harassed in the same way.
Having a communist say that, who's supporting the president, and who the workers are like listening to and organizing with, right? Like it's just completely different.
Completely different, and so incredibly important. So, oh wow! So this was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of your, you know, little bit and snippet of the book with us. And I encourage everybody to read it. It's fantastic. And so well done. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much. Bye. Take care.